February of 2007, a lady in her mid-70s in Decatur, Georgia, decided that she would Google the name of her great-grandfather into her computer and see what she can find. So she typed in General Robert Hatton and clicked search. She was amazed to discover the General Robert Hatton Camp of the Sons of Confederate Veterans, SCV, here in Lebanon. She then at once sent an email to its commander. This was the first time that anyone here had had contact with a descendant of General Hatton, and the man was very excited. He gave Mrs. Tosin an invitation to come to Lebanon to visit the General's monument on the square, his tomb and monument in Cedar Grove Cemetery, and to meet the men here who carried on his memory. This lady eagerly prepared a trip, and as soon as she could work it out, she arrived here in Lebanon on the 22nd of February 2007, a cold but a very sunny, beautiful day. She brought with her a brother and several other family members. I knew about none of this until early that afternoon when I was sitting at my desk in my office and received a call from Dave Simpson, then he's now deceased, but at that time he was a deacon at the Maple Hill congregation and also a member of the SCV. He told me, "Burton, something really exciting is happening in Cedar Grove. A special lady is visiting here, and I think that you should meet her and talk with her." So I hustled over there and found something like 12, 15 people, some prominent in local affairs, plus a newspaper reporter to get a story and some pictures. I was introduced to Ms. Tosin, who was brimming with enthusiasm. After talking a few minutes with me, she then wandered away to visit the graves of some other members of the Hatton family. I remained by the General's monument talking with someone. I seem to remember it was Mayor Don Fox. Suddenly, Dave Simpson ran up to me, grabbed me by the arm, and explained, "Come over here to Mrs. Tosin. She has something that I want you to see." When I reached her, she handed me a very beautiful gold ring and said that it had been passed down to her from her great-grandmother, the General's wife, whose name was Sophie, and who died in 1916. She then said, "Mr. Whited, look inside the ring at the inscription. For 50 years since I got this ring, I've been asking this person and that person if they could read it and explain it, but no one has ever had a clue. But Mr. Simpson here said there's a man standing over yonder that I bet can read it." So she handed me the ring, and I looked at it for a moment, and I said, "Well, it's written in Hebrew. There are 2 words, each consisting of 4 letters each. The first one contains the letters Mem, Tzadi, Peh, and Heth." And I said, "That's the word mitzpah." Then I read the second one, Gimel, Lamed, Ayin, and Daleth. And I said, "That's the word Galiad." Then after a few seconds, I exclaimed, "Why, it's obvious to me what this is. This is a direct and very clear reference to the mitzpah benediction in Genesis 31 and verse 49. There wasn't room to inscribe the entire verse inside the ring, so they wrote only the place name where it was given, at Mitzpah, in the territory of Gilead, now Gilead, which is east of the Dead Sea. No one there had ever heard about this verse. And Mrs. Towson said, "Well, please tell me what it means." I answered, "I will in just a moment, but first, I'd like to say something about your grandmother, your great-grandmother, and then you tell me if I'm right or wrong." At some point, she separated herself from her family for a long, long time, and her family, anticipating it naturally, was very sad. So they pooled their money to buy this expensive ring, to have it inscribed, and they gave it to her as she left. I don't believe, folks, in my lifetime I have ever shocked anyone as much as I did Mrs. Towson with that statement. Literally, her mouth flew open, her eyes enlarged, and here's exactly what she said. "Are you a prophet?" I answered, "No, ma'am, far from it. But I know what the mitzvah benediction is all about, and it would not be in this ring unless what I have just said were true." Then she told me, hardly anybody outside our family knows this, but several years after General Hatton was killed, Sophie became a Methodist missionary to Japan and was there for 15 years. And before she departed, her family gave this ring to her as something to remember them by. Then I said, "Ma'am, it was that, but it was a lot more than that. It was actually a blessing wrapped in a covenant by her loved ones, that God would watch over her while she was away in Japan, and also over them who were left behind here in Lebanon." Then I quoted Genesis 31 and verse 49, which I knew by heart. "The Lord watch over you and me while we are absent one from another." That night, Mrs. Towson spoke to a civic group here in Lebanon who had provided for her a very nice dinner. And somewhere in her remarks, she said this: "I came here today to learn more about my famous great-grandfather and to see his monuments, and I've done that and really enjoyed it. But then," she said, "now I consider the greatest benefit of my trip to find out after 50 years what this inscription inside my ring means." Now, let's leave that and turn back the hands of time 3,500 years and go into the Bible and find out the setting for this mitzvah benediction so that we can understand its meaning and its significance. It begins in the 27th chapter of Genesis when the ailing Isaac decided to confer the patriarchal blessing upon his two sons, Esau and Laban. By deception, Jacob posed himself as Esau and received his brother's birthright. When Esau discovered this, he was enraged and resolved that he would kill Jacob. But their mother Rebekah heard about his resolve and quickly acted to save Jacob. She sent him away, far away, into the land of Padan Aram to her brother Laban, who was a wealthy man and owned large herds of sheep and goats and other animals. He also had two virgin daughters, Leah and Rachel. Rachel was the younger and very beautiful. Leah, the older, was rather plain looking. Like most men then and now, Jacob wanted the more beautiful for his wife. And folks, I'm no different. When I went to get married, I picked out the most beautiful girl in the Madison, Goodlettsville area. I would have had no other. Since he had nothing of value to offer Laban for her, he agreed to work for him 7 years as a shepherd. But the morning after the marriage, Jacob woke up and found out that this woman lying beside him in bed without her veil on was plain Jane Leah. So then he went directly to Laban and protested. But that wily father answered, "It's not the custom here to give the younger daughter before the older, but serve me for 7 more years, and then I will give you Rachel." Jacob was so bedazzled by this gorgeous Aramean princess that he agreed. And in the meantime, he started having a family with Leah. As the years passed there in Padan Aram, he had 6 sons by Leah, 2 by her handmaid, 2 by Rachel's handmaid, and 1 by Rachel. And I just wonder, if there had been more handmaids, how many more children would Jacob have had? Laban also paid Jacob wages. At first, it was the spotted sheep. But when they were all born spotted, he changed it to the speckled. And then when they were all joined speckled or striped, he changed it again. And Jacob later said that Laban changed his wages 10 times. But God was with Jacob. And Genesis 30 and verse 43 says that he became exceedingly prosperous and had large flocks and female and male servants and camels and donkeys. Laban became very frustrated by all of this and then extremely angry. And Jacob began to see that something very bad was building up. And so one day he moved his family with his flocks and his herds 3 days distant from Laban. And then on a good day, he made a run for Canaan, both to return to his own people from whom he had been separated 20 years, and also to get away from Laban. But Laban discovered it pretty quickly, and with an armed band, he took out after Jacob. His pursuit, or rather his purpose, was probably to kill Jacob, to seize his family and all of his wealth and bring them back to Padan Aram and add them to his own domain. And after a week's chase, he caught up with Jacob and his company at a place called Mizpah in the territory of Gilead. Laban was all set to attack Jacob the next day. But during the night, God appeared to him in a dream with a grave warning. Genesis 31:24, he said, "Take heed to yourself that you do not speak to Jacob, either good or bad." To use a modern Yiddish expression or statement, God put the kibosh on Jacob, or rather on Laban, when he confronted Jacob the next day. Although he was as mad as a hornet, he had to keep calm and stay peaceful. The two men had a lengthy but very tense conversation there at Mizpah, which is recorded in chapter 31, verses 36 through 42. Two passions were seething inside of Laban. First, he wanted to knock Jacob around for a while for running away with a good part of his family and his wealth. You see, his jealousy and envy had grown to the point that he wished to do bodily harm to Jacob, as jealousy and envy usually does if they're not checked. Second, Laban loved his 2 daughters and the 11 grandchildren they had produced. He did not want them to vanish into a distant land where he would never see them again. This is clear from what Laban says there in verse 43. He said, "The daughters are my daughters, and their children are my children, and the flocks and the herds are mine. But what can I do this day for my daughters and for their children whom they have borne?" And folks, that statement brings in something that needs explanation, because we just don't have anything like it in our society today. In ancient times, a family remained intact as long as the father lived, and he was the ruler of it all. When sons married, they didn't go off anywhere. They remained with their father under his authority. The women they had married were considered as belonging to that father, and the children that they brought forth were considered as belonging to that father. And thus grandsons or grandchildren were taken to be the sons and daughters of the father, their grandfather. And when grandsons married, they stayed there. They and their wives and all they had, including their children, which would be great-grandchildren, were considered still as belonging to the father. Folks, this is what the word patriarch means. A father, that's the P-A-T-E-R part, ark who rules, a father who rules. Only when the old man died did his family break up into new families, with each son then becoming a patriarch. And many times by that time, the son had children and grandchildren himself. Folks, this explains a great deal about various issues in the Old Testament that very few people know about. Consequently, there's a lot of fumbling and stumbling around when the Old Testament is taught, and issues are explained wrongly because there's no understanding. And that comes up right here. When Jacob, or rather Laban, said, "The daughters are my daughters, and their children are my children, and the flocks and herds are my herds," he wasn't just blowing smoke of anger. According to the customs, institutions of that country, he was literally correct. And this is why he was so enraged at Jacob and wanted to hurt him. You see, the way Laban saw it, and the law of the land saw it there, Jacob was making away with a good part of Laban's family, and he was running off with a pretty good part of his wealth, and Laban meant to get it back. The only thing that prevented him was that warning which God gave him. You see, God is not bound by human customs and conventions. He had a plan for Jacob, and it did not include Laban. Folks, that is the background and the setting for the Mitzvah benediction. Laban had to concede to the inevitable will of God. He had to let Jacob, his family, and all of his flocks and herds go. And that's why he said, what can I do this day for my daughters and their children? All he could do was to propose a covenant with his family group and the new family group of Jacob that had just been established. Folks, a biblical covenant always consists of 3 essential parts. The first is an agreement between 2 parties with God as the witness. The second is a physical sign of some kind that portrays the agreement. And the third part is a blessing bestowed in keeping the agreement. In verses 44 through 53, you can read the details of that covenant yourself. The agreement was that no one from Jacob's family would pass beyond Mizpah to bother Laban, and no one from Laban's family would come this side of Mizpah to bother Jacob. God, as Yahweh Elohim, is prominently named here as the one who witnessed this covenant and would enforce it. For the physical sign, Jacob set up a tall monolith. Then he and Laban surrounded it with quite a pile of rocks or stones. Jacob in his Hebrew called it Gilead, and Laban in his Aramaic tongue called it Yagar Sahadatha. The blessing of the covenant is what Laban uttered in verse 41. The Lord Yahweh watch between you and me while we are absent one from another. And this is what has since been called the Mizpah benediction. And to me it is very beautiful, very affectionate if you look into it. It means this: in our separation, I can no longer help you and you can no longer help me. But God, who is a witness to this covenant, will be with you and he will be with me. And he will bless you when I can't, and he will bless me when you can't. This is what was tenderly expressed inside of that ring of Sophie Riley Hatton when she left for Japan. There wasn't room to write that whole verse in there, so they just put the two words that marked where it took place, Mizpah, Gilead. Folks, from that ring came all that I have just presented to you in the last few minutes, and that I related to a small gathering of people in the cemetery on Maple Street 13 years ago. It came about without notice. It just loomed up. To me, it was really a great experience. Now, coming to the present, what can we make out of all this that means something to you and me and has relevance? Well, as I see it, there are three practical applications, and I'm just going to give them to you. You can do with them whatever you will. The first concerns how we teach the Bible in church. Most of what we do is make quick surveys of books, of periods, sometimes of topics. A man in Rutherford County, when I was speaking on this, objected and said, "But Burton, we need the big picture." Indeed, we need the big picture. But we also need the small picture. And what's that? It's the details which look carefully and deeply into what God has said in His Word. Folks, every sentence in the Bible has a depth to it. Every word in the Bible really has a depth to it that very seldom do we plumb because we're just water surfing across the top of it. Folks, these details are important because how do we live our lives? We don't live our lives in a big picture. If anybody ever writes your biography, that'll be the big picture. But that's not the way you live your life. You live your life in a succession of details, specific details that just like links in a chain hook one to another and make up the experience of life. In the church, we're experts on the big picture, but so often we're confused and lost and befuddled when it comes to details. And we mess up when we don't know how to apply the details of God's Word to the details of life. That's how we experience life in detail. The Mizpah benediction of Genesis 31:49 is a detail. It's one I did not learn in a Bible class. I learned it in intense study in my my own office at home. But I'm so glad that I had learned it and was conversant with it on the 22nd of February 2007. The second application follows from 1 Peter 3:15, where it says, always be ready to give an answer to everyone who asks you concerning the hope that is in you. When it comes to giving biblical answers, we need to be proactive rather than retroactive. If we don't study carefully, deeply, and learn details in advance, we cannot ask questions that arise in detail on the spur of the moment as we're passing through a day. When we come to such a situation, typically the approach is to make an urgent appeal to the preacher, the recognized expert, to provide that needed detailed information. But that seldom works. You seldom can get a hold of him at the spur of the moment at a time like this. Of course, folks, no one is able to learn every detail and know everything, and I'm not saying that. What I am saying is that intensive study as time passes, as God gives you day by day, on and on, will increase your knowledge and your ability to be of real service on the spot. And from time to time, you'll be able to deal with something on the spot that you would not have been able to if you weren't doing that kind of study. Because I had learned, fortunately, the details of the mitzvah benediction, I had the chance opportunity to teach an ad hoc audience, impromptu, in the cemetery on Maple Street that would never be present in a class in this church building or any other Church of Christ building. Nearly all of them were Methodists. They were from out of Lebanon, and many of them from out of state. But they gave me rapt attention as I spoke to them that evening among the tombstones. And later, there was further communication with some of them by mail. Only God knows where all of that led, but perhaps it opened doors of opportunity that otherwise would not have been opened. I hope so. The third and last application is to use the mitzvah benediction on a personal basis. When you are being separated from some time from a loved one, and folks, it's going to happen. With most of us who are older, it's already happened. Like when a child goes away to college, or when a son or now a daughter goes off into the military service, or a child takes a job halfway across the country in a distant place. Being in different places, you cannot help one another immediately when it is needed. But God is in both places. God is a witness to the covenant you made with that departed person if you're using the mitzvah benediction, and He can and will bless that person in that place and you where you are, especially if you're both actively praying. And this is especially true, and you might not think about this, but this is especially true when the separation is due to death. You see, God is with us who are still here, but God is with the person who is beyond the grave. There's nothing you can do for a person who has died except hold their memory dear and precious and memorialize them, and thus we spend hundreds and hundreds of dollars putting up a monument at their grave and then continually keeping it beautiful with flowers. But folks, if that person died in the Lord, he or she is in Christ's presence. And you here have Christ with you. He's in both places. And you can pray to God and ask blessings. Remember those precious, meaningful words. The Lord watch between you and me while we're absent one from another. And I can hardly think of anything more precious to stay at the graveside than that. And finally, don't forget the physical sign of the covenant. What about that inscribed ring of Sophie Hatton? After some 140 years, it still has great meaning, great significance, and great intrinsic value, as I experienced it that day. Folks, that's the lesson. Do with it as you will. Now we extend the invitation of the gospel. If you need to be baptized into Christ, the invitation is yours. It can be taken care of within minutes, and you can leave here a child of God. If you're not at peace and in union with the Lord right now because of disobedience, come. Express that, and we'll pray with you and for you, and God will forgive you, and you can leave here with peace in your heart and in your soul, knowing that again you're back with Christ. Will you come as we stand and sing?